Welcome back to World War Now, everybody. I am your host, Conrad Franz, joined as always by Dmitry Kalygin. It's good to have him back. We have a huge show this week. All things in World War III are continuing to escalate. We're going to be talking about the situation in Syria as Israel continues to annex land in the south, as Turkey directly advances across in the north, directly going to war with Kurdish forces there, annexing effectively new territories with Turkish actual troops on the ground in some of these places. We're going to be talking about all of that, the developing inevitable conflict between Russia and Turkey, which is something that we talk a lot about on this show. We're going to be talking about the situation in Russia as they continue to advance against Ukraine, and talks of negotiations and ceasefires continue to loom. We're going to be talking about the ceasefire in Lebanon, the Ansar Allah Houthi missiles that continue to be launched at Tel Aviv, the situation going in Africa, the situation in Libya, as perhaps Russia attempts to balance the situation on the Mediterranean as Syria has fallen. Again, we're going to be talking all about these elections, things going on in Germany, Canada, all these sorts of things, the terrorist attack in Germany by this Saudi national. We're going to be talking about all of this and much, much more, the things we always talk about on World War Now, some church news, obviously. But before we get into any of that, we do have to say this is our 100th episode. For those of you that have already read the title, this is a very big deal. We've been doing this show for over 2 years. And frankly, when we started, I had no idea that eventually I'd be doing a 100th episode. We also have nearly 60 episodes, well, over 60 if you count the numbering system properly, of Ether Hour episodes. So this is a lot of content we've put out. So it's been quite the ride. I wanted to hear your thoughts on, the past 2 years, World War Now, World War III, everything, Dmitry. What are your thoughts on 100 episodes?
It's good to be here, Conrad. And my thoughts, I'm frankly surprised that the news cycle has kept us so occupied. In fact, both in writing our articles and in producing some of the podcast episodes here for our dear listeners, it's been quite difficult some weeks, even keeping up with all the important news stories, prioritizing exactly what we'll speak about in a coherent fashion, because, well, frankly, all around the world, conflicts are emerging. Some conflicts, of course, end or are put on ice for a time. But as we're looking at it today, it seems that at the 100th episode, things are becoming more and more serious, and the situation around the world is turning into an uncontrolled conflict, frankly. It seems like even the powers which we thought had some sort of grasp at the geopolitical situation, even on their own home fronts, simply the opportunities are slipping out of their grasp. We've seen entire nations fall. We've seen revolutions take place, certain rebellions, like in the case of Prigozhin in Russia. We've seen terrorist acts of all sorts and all kinds of manipulations by the mainstream media, which we've reported on. So in fact, our sort of particular position on geopolitical analysis and our particular approach of Orthodox journalism covering political, geopolitical events from a very Christian conservative perspective has, I think, been effective, and we've achieved certain fruits. We've had a lot of really good feedback, and we've made certain corrections throughout the 100 and plus episodes on the show. So I think going forward, not only will we see further improvements, but I think as the news become more and more extreme, as we've seen in these last few episodes of the fall of Syria, I think we'll continue to cover it more and more accurately, and perhaps even going into the future as the community expands. Now we have a Discord available for the people to speak to directly, and sort of people have been actually giving us stories that they think we should cover. We've kind of integrated our World War Now coverage to kind of expand beyond just the two of us, Conrad. We have other people, of course, giving us direct input into what they think, what kind of information should be provided to a broader audience. So it's quite good. I think it's almost like a community that's being built, and I think going forward, it'll be very fruitful, sort of working together with our dear listeners who've been contributing to us for the last 2 years, monetarily as well, subscribing. And even some of our listeners and contributors have become guests on the show as well, right? We can mention a few people like your good friend Gregory Hears, who's contributed to our St. John Vatatzis episode and has done such extensive research. And we have a lot more, of course, content coming up in the future, like future 8th hour episodes with guests such as Isaac Swalem, your recent analysis on episode 99, GSP, of course, from the War Report, just really great guests who are also listeners, also contributors. I mean, it's been a fantastic journey so far, and it really doesn't seem exhausting. It's like every week, 100 episodes, the stories go on, and every week it's interesting to come back, to discuss, to analyze, to write down notes, and to do our research, and to prepare for every subsequent episode. I think, without any exaggeration, I think the show is going to expand further, because there's really no way around it. People want to hear our particular opinions, even though they know we don't necessarily come from an entirely unbiased particular position. Yourself as an American, myself as a Russian, we do have our own biases, but we do attempt to cover these stories from a very Christian, perspective, which I think is somewhat unusual and rare in today's world. We have a lot of conservative right-wing commentators, but not many who try to cover news in an unfiltered fashion as well. And we don't necessarily censor the very sensitive parts as well. As you'll see in this episode today, where we will definitely be cooking up a storm in regards to the recent events taking place around the world.
No, that's definitely true. And there are so many people we have to thank. I want to just thank the audience first and foremost. Obviously, those of you that have contributed both just with shares, but also those that have contributed financially to supporting us behind the paywall here on Substack. None of this could be possible without you. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to do this amazing thing in my life. I mean, this has provided some of the most incredible opportunities that I've ever been able to do. I mean, this, sure, in combination with some other things, but this allowed me to go and do the things that I was able to do in Russia, do the things I was able to do in Greece and Cyprus on Mount Athos. And I guess first and foremost there, I have to thank Father Joseph Gleason, Charles Bausman, as far as the Russia things go. They have been big supporters of this show and me since day one, pretty much, since episode 1. I got to thank Dr. Steve Turley, my original boss at my old job, who did share the original episodes of the show. Definitely need to thank Woo Dee Woo, our thumbnail maker, who has made most of the fantastic thumbnails for this show that definitely wouldn't be, many people might not have clicked on the show if it wasn't for these fantastic thumbnails. So we want to thank him for all of the hard work, because he's going to have to move on to do some other things. We're going to be getting someone else. So big appreciation to him. Want to thank Ben, our editor, who has really made a lot of these things easier for the past few weeks. He has been helping us out, and getting the editor in general was only possible thanks to the support from you guys again. So want to thank you there. Want to thank Jay Dyer for sharing our content for a long time. David Erhan, another well-known guest who has helped us out with a lot of things. Anthony of Westgate, somebody that we definitely can't not thank. Father Peter Hears, of course, we mentioned Gregory. Father Peter is somebody that has shared and supported our content for a long time, and again, brought me to Mount Athos with him, brought me to meet Metropolitan Neophytos, in no small part because of what we did on the show. So again, thank you to everybody that shared and allowed Dimitri and I to do this and make a little bit of money doing it, and allow that to give us the boost we needed to spend more time researching and bringing you the content that we know you really love, because it's been very humbling, and hearing from all of you around the world. There's so many other people we could thank. So apologies if I left anybody out, but Felicia, Father James, so many other people that I could thank. I don't want to, anybody that doesn't want to be thanked, I don't want to thank them and dox them in any way as well. But again, thank you all so much for the support and the shares and everything, because without you, none of this would be possible. And I know there are several people, if not more, who have, been brought into Orthodoxy and have been encouraged to pursue Orthodoxy further because of this show. And that's what it's really all about, right? So again, thank you to everybody who has prayed for us, priests, monastics, bishops, lay people, everybody. Thank you so much. And yeah, none of this would be possible without you. So thank you so much for 100 episodes of World War Now. And here's to 100, 1,000, a million, probably not, but 1,000 plus more, right? So very, very wonderful. Been an amazing 2 years. But with all of that, we do have to get into this World War III analysis. And I think we do have to start in Syria. Obviously, we know that all these fronts are not completely coalescing, because anything in Syria has to do with what's going on in Russia and Iran and Israel and Egypt and even Libya at this point. So much of these things are coming together. But Syria seems to be, obviously, the HTS has claimed that they will be coalescing all power. There will be one united Syria. They will be not this big factionalism and all these splits across geographic regions, but that they will be the consolidated central power ruling all of Syria from Damascus. But again, what exactly that will look like, people don't really know. They've already conceded to the Alawite forces that they can have ethnic Alawite militias after footage was emerging of them being attacked and assaulted by HTS. We have the ongoing Israeli, of course, invasion of the south in Quneitra as they continue to press their buffer zone with the Golan, taking more and more villages. We have the Druze, people continuing to call for secession and joining with Israel of these Druze majority regions in southern Syria. I'm wondering if they also want to include the Druze majority regions in Lebanon in that. I'm curious, of course, but at the same time as this Israeli invasion is ongoing, we have Netanyahu visiting Mount Hermon and the Israeli troops destroying crosses and places that have been set up by Syrian Christians. Again, these are places that Muslims and even Muslim extremists had occupied in the past during the Syrian civil war, yet these crosses survived. Yet the moment the Jews show up, they're gone. So shows you what we're really working with here. But At the same time, in the north, the Turks are fully invading. As I said earlier, they're doing their effectively special military operation to de-Kurdify the northeastern regions of Syria from the YPG and the PKK, which are major enemies of the Turkish state, classified as terrorist organizations. And Erdogan has even pledged in 2 weeks to visit Damascus. And all of this, Turkey, we know, are the big winners in Syria as this unfolds. And the Turkish foreign minister was forced to respond. This is from Al Jazeera. Turkish FM denies Trump claim of unfriendly takeover by Turkey in Syria. Turkey's foreign minister Hakan Fidan has denied a claim by incoming United States President Donald Trump that the toppling of Syrian leader Bashar al-Assad was an unfriendly takeover by Turkey. In remarks apparently praising Ankara, Trump told a news conference earlier this week that Turkey was very smart and had carried out an unfriendly takeover without a lot of lives being lost in Syria. In an interview with Al Jazeera broadcast on Wednesday, the Turkish FM said it would be a grave mistake to describe the current events in Syria as a takeover by Turkey. For Syrian people, it is not a takeover. I think that if there is any takeover, it's the will of the Syrian people, which is taking over now. So this is important because it shows that Turkey is committed to this narrative that the current rebellious takeover is something that will solidify a united Sunni majority Syrian state, and with full Turkish control, effectively. What was a sort of Russian, Iranian proxy that didn't have full control over its territory will now become a neo-Ottoman proxy that does effectively wield control over most of its territory, including over these regions that are controlled by minorities like Alawites and Shia and, maybe not Druze, but that'll just be totally controlled by Israel. So it's clear that as of now, Turkey and Israel are the two most powerful players in the region. Iran and the axis of resistance has very much been shattered, and Russia continues to move its forces from its ports in Latakia and Tartus, moving some of them to Libya, moving some of them back to Russia up in the Black Sea. But overall, it is just, again, it's total Turkish victory right now in Syria. Of course, the U.S. is benefiting as well, but frankly, not as much directly as the Turks. And this is from Dave DeCamp at antiwar.com. The U.S. had foreknowledge of HTS offensive to topple Assad and prepared other rebel groups to join. He said the U.S. had foreknowledge of the offensive led by the al-Qaeda-linked Hayat Tahrir al-Sham that ousted former Syrian President Bashar al-Assad and helped another rebel group join the fight, the Telegraph reported on Wednesday. The report said the U.S. notified the Revolutionary Commando Army, a U.S.-funded militia based out of a U.S. base at Al-Tanf in southern Syria, to be ready for an attack that could lead to an end of Assad's rule. They did not tell us how it would happen, Bashar al-Mashadani, an RCA commander, told the Telegraph. We were just told everything is about to change. This is your moment. Either Assad will fall or you will fall. But they did not say when or where. They just told us to be ready. In October, the U.S. brought several other Sunni Muslim militias under the command of the RCA, swelling the force from 800 fighters to about 3,000. All of the fighters are armed by the U.S., and the U.S. pays their salaries of $400 per month. The U.S. also backs the Kurdish-led SDF in eastern Syria, but the RCA is a separate force. When the HTS-led force began its offensive from Syria's northwest Idlib province and advanced south toward Damascus, the RCA headed north. According to the Telegraph, the U.S.-funded group now controls about one-fifth of Syria's territory. Mashadani spoke to the paper from a Syrian government airbase that was used by Russia outside of the city of Palmyra. So clearly, despite the fact that Trump is saying that, oh, this is shocking, good job to the Turks, they did this takeover. Obviously, the powers that be in the State Department right now knew this was going to happen and collaborated to create a much more Turkified Middle East. And I want to get your thoughts on that, Dimitri. Before we do, I want to read this other report from Jason Ditz. It says, Israel seizes new villages in southern Syria, fires on protesters opposing the occupation. So certain groups, Christians, Muslims, are protesting against the Israeli occupation in these regions just east of the Golan Heights in southern Syria, and the Israelis immediately resorted to using live ammunition. And this report says, initially suggested to be about establishing a new buffer zone between the Israeli-occupied Golan Heights and southwestern Syria, the Israeli incursion after the regime change continues to grow, with them seizing yet more villages in the Dara province. Israeli troops advanced into the villages of Mariah and Jamla as part of their continued operations. Dozens of locals protested against Israel's occupation near the Al Jazeera barracks, just outside of Mariah. Israeli troops opened fire using live rounds against the protesters. At least one injury was confirmed, and I can confirm that this person ended up dying. So one person died from this situation. Mariah and Jamilia are only a few kilometers from the Purple Line, which separates Israeli-occupied Golan from the rest of Syria. The villages are also on the opposite side of the existing demilitarized zone set up for the UN disengagement observer forces. After the ouster of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad earlier this month, Israel moved across the Purple Line and into Syrian territory. Early on, they seized areas around Mount Hermon, which is in the northernmost part of the UNDOF zone. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu was recently at Mount Hermon for a photo op and said troops will be staying there through at least the end of 2025. So this sounds like it's a full-on annexation of Syrian territory by the Israelis, and we can only guess how much that's going to be, because if we add up all that Druze territory, that ends up looking like a solid chunk of that southern territory, again, making Greater Israel very real, which is what it is. So I want to hear your thoughts specifically on the Turkish and Israeli invasions, Dimitri, because they seem to be the two biggest beneficiaries from all of this.
Oh, absolutely. And I've heard even Russian spokespersons and people in the media who are quite critical of the Syrian Arab army and perhaps even spoke out in favor of the HTS takeover, which may seem a bit surprising, but those are, of course, these commentators were very closely aligned with Ramzan Kadyrov, who we'll discuss, I think, shortly in the episode, very interesting positions. But even they've discussed Israel's takeover of southern Syria and the creation of this buffer zone as a very predatory move. Israel is literally like a predator sensing the weakness of its prey. The hundreds, over 500 airstrikes that Israel has carried over the territory of Syria in the last 2 weeks have tripled or quadrupled the number of airstrikes that we've seen since essentially October 7th. So all those strikes we discussed throughout the year on the Damascus airports, on the so-called armament storages for Hezbollah near Khmeimim and Latakia, or even near Tartus and other places very close to Russian bases by Israel, they've all been essentially put into the shadow by the recent strikes against former Syrian Arab, sovereign equipment. This is airplanes, naval equipment, tanks, etc., all kinds of armaments and storage which never belonged to Hezbollah in the first place, but which Israel and people aligned with Israel are stating that they would not allow HTS and other militants to take over. At the same time, Israel has not announced or declared war against HTS in any way, so the current takeover we're seeing in southern Syria is being dealt with a very serpent-like demeanor. So Israel essentially slivering in very sort of at a fast pace, but at the same time not delivering an ultimatum to the new government in Damascus. And mind you, the Israeli troops, by some reports, are essentially 10 to 15 miles outside of Damascus. Now, would Israel essentially go into a city of 2 million plus people, such as Damascus, and essentially begin a sort of novel takeover as we've seen in the Gaza Strip? Most likely not. But Israel, I think, would be happy with the newly acquired territories. Mind you, politically, somebody like Benjamin Netanyahu, the Israeli prime minister, will benefit greatly from these newly acquired territories, which in some ways even dwarf the gains that Israel made in the 1960s and 70s. In many ways, he's kind of putting himself on the board as one of the greatest Israeli prime ministers, if we're speaking about pure Zionist sovereignty and Zionist interests that Israel has ever seen. So even if he is found guilty in the legal procedures which are actually taking place right now, as Israel is taking territory and establishing itself upon Syrian land, and Netanyahu personally is sort of securing his own legacy, right? Even before perhaps his leave of politics, which may take place very soon, because a lot of people are unhappy with his leadership of the country, that is in Israel itself, especially the liberal Israelis, because Netanyahu is very much a hawkish character, as we've seen through recent events, especially the genocide of the Palestinians. It's worth mentioning, of course, that the only country thus far who's very strongly critiqued Israel's presence in southern Syria has been Iran. And of course, Russia has somewhat refrained from labeling Israel as a country which has breached the 1974 peace agreement between Bashar al-Assad's father in 1974 and Israel. Notice, me and Conrad even spoke about this off air, that Syria has never breached that 1974 peace disengagement agreement between Syria and Israel ever. So even during the wars between Hezbollah and Israel, Syria and Bashar al-Assad, Syria has never essentially breached that agreement and has never attacked Israel directly, despite the fact that the Golan Heights is still constitutionally Syrian territory, which again leads us to question, Conrad, these new proclamations by HTS leader Emir al-Jalani, when he states that HTS and the new oppositionary government of Syria, this new sort of Syrian sovereign state, or the Greens, as they like to call themselves sometimes, will this new Sunni supremacist government be happy with Israel acquiring and holding more Syrian territory than the Assads ever lost during those conflicts in the 70s and 80s? Because it's more than the Golan Heights that now Syria in the future will need to reacquire from Israel. And of course, when HTS makes these proclamations, I've seen many sort of takes on this when they say, well, we're looking for a peaceful agreement with Israel, what kind of an Israel are they speaking about? We know Hamas does support HTS. They've spoken out in favor of the oppositionary government in Damascus at the moment. For better or for worse, Hamas has aligned themselves with this new pro-Sunni takeover. And the question does arise whether or not HTS will assist the Palestinian Hamas cause going into the future. And when they say we will have a peaceful agreement with Israel, are they speaking about a new Israel, the post-Benjamin Netanyahu, maybe dual state Israel, where Palestine is given some formal representation, maybe a two-state solution, which many in the UN are speaking about? We don't know exactly if al-Jilani is a complete NPC type of controlled puppet, or whether or not he will actually be pursuing some sort of Sunni supremacist representation, maybe even protecting the Palestinian people. At this point, Conrad, we have to take the more pessimistic angle, and just given the fact that Israel has benefited so greatly from the fall of Assad, which was essentially an anti-Zionist government. The Assad government has always been against Israel, despite the fact that they've never declared war on Israel, never attacked Israel's territory proper. But they have, Assad personally has spoken out against the Holocaust, against Zionist supremacy in world media, and the entire world, mostly run by these Talmudic characters, has openly declared war on Assad's Syria. You have to recall that Syria was the most sanctioned, the most attacked country besides the Russian Federation today after the beginning of the SMO. So with the fall of Assad's Syria, we have to come to terms that the entire world, the entire sort of Western world in particular, 50 plus nations, not only sanctioned Syria into this economic pit of depression, but also attacked it and also funded these various terroristic and anti-Assad movements throughout the years. So essentially, Syria did not fall just to a certain band of rebels. It fell to the globalist system, which essentially declared war upon it. And so I guess we have to just concentrate that Israel has made significant gains. It has reestablished itself. There's no indication that HTS, especially now that they're seeing increased conflicts, especially on a diplomatic angle, but most likely in the near future, we'll see an open proclamation of some sort of conflict between HTS and the Kurds, which again aligns us with the Turkish angle, the Turks as well, in funding and in the arming and of course the support of HTS, have also found the Kurds to be a common enemy. HTS will most likely not look further south of Damascus at these Golan Heights adjacent territories as any sort of geography of priority. They will most likely align with the Turks in this sort of anti-Kurdish futuristic Sunni crusade, right? But we have to keep in mind the Kurds themselves are Sunni Muslims. So this does bring to mind this great sort of Islamic hypocrisy, which we see here, because remember, they also proclaimed the entire Syrian oppositionary movement as a Sunni liberation from the Alawite elites that have kept Syria in this state of secularized lukewarmness for the last 60 plus years. They've all announced that the Sunnis need to free themselves, and now they're fighting against Kurdish Sunnis. So again, very questionable sort of politics going forward by HTS. But I think at this point, we have to just keep a neutral to pessimistic position that HTS will simply allow Israel to keep these territories occupied. Given Israel's past actions in northern Gaza, the settlement of the West Bank, and we know Israel from its past actions, when it takes territory, Conrad, it cements itself there. It does not seek to leave. It's similar to Ukraine, for example. When Ukraine took large territories from Russia in Slavyansk, Kramatorsk, etc., how these Talmudic characters play is they position themselves, they build fortresses, they build defensive structures. They will not seek to leave what they've recently obtained from the Syrian people. And so the Arab Syrian population will, I think, greatly be hindered going forward, especially if they need to fight a war of Reconquista against the Israelis in the future. Like, there's a lot more territory now that they need to recapture.
No, that's definitely true. And I think, sure, the ideal Israeli situation would have somehow been a Kurdish, Druze-controlled Syrian state. But this Sunni fake al-Qaeda derivative control is probably second or third best from the Israeli perspective. And of course, number one best for the Turkish perspective. And I just want to make sure everybody understands the kind of map situation. There's already been visual confirmation. I've seen the videos of Turkish convoys enter the Syrian city of Jarablus in northern Syria, which borders the SDF-controlled city of Ain al-Arab, which this is fully in, Syrian Kurdistan, de facto Kurdistan as it's called. And again, we know that generally speaking, the SAA completely surrendered. However, in different parts of Syria, for example, in Talfita, North Damascus, we have footage of Syrian Arab army resistance groups ambushing rebel forces, and we have reports from HTS media saying that there are SAA resistance pockets in the Damascus area led by Mar al-Assad, the brother of Bashar, who, was one of the main military generals in the military. We have no idea what exactly the communication situation is with Assad. We know that Assad was at the Latakia base, and he was claiming to be controlling the situation on the ground from there in Damascus. And then ultimately, next thing you know, Latakia fell and he was forced to evacuate with the Russians. Like I mentioned in the previous episode, there were reports that some of his cousins ended up getting killed by HTS and other forces. So again, it does seem like it was pretty sudden in the midst of all of that. But the situation, of course, as Israel pushes in the south, we know that Turkey, if they had any interest in actually encountering Israel at this point, they would have stopped supplying them with 40% of their oil. They would have actually sanctioned the Azerbaijani state oil company, sanctioned Israel in any way, provided any kind of blockade. Of course, Turkey's perfectly capable of bombing Israel as well. They have massive weapons and missiles, but nothing like that was obviously going to happen because clearly the Turco-Israeli axis is much more favorable to obviously the U.S., but also just to the Israelis in general. They are much less threatened by the Turks than they are the Arabs, and let alone the Persians. So that's clearly what's going on there. But this is from Al Jazeera. I might have to cast aspersions on this. The headline is Putin plans to meet Bashar al-Assad, says Russia not defeated in Syria. President Vladimir Putin says Russia has not been defeated in Syria after rebel groups ousted his ally and longtime leader Bashar al-Assad earlier this month. In his first public comments on the subject on Thursday, Putin said he had not yet met the former Syrian ruler who fled the Russian capital, that he will definitely talk to him and plan to meet him in Moscow. He mentioned he would ask al-Assad about the fate of missing United States reporter Austin Tice, whose release was described by the White House as a top priority. Speaking at his annual end-of-year news conference, Putin also dismissed claims that Russia, which intervened in Syria in 2015 and turned the tide of the civil war there in al-Assad's favor, had suffered a loss with the fall of the former regime. You want to present what is happening in Syria as a defeat for Russia, Putin said. I assure you it is not. We have achieved our goals. He said Russia intervened in Syria to prevent a terrorist enclave from being created there, and that it is not for nothing that today many European countries and the United States want to establish relations with them. And this comes in upon him saying that the takeover in Syria was not a terrorist takeover, because if it was, the U.S. would have recognized them as terrorists, which, I'm sorry, but that might be one of the stupidest things I've ever heard. And I'm not saying everything Putin said recently was stupid. A lot of his comments were interesting, but if that's true, then the Ukrainians in Azov aren't terrorists. The people in any of these countries that are trying to disrupt Russian spheres of influence and killing Russians and persecuting even people for the Russian language and have crucified people in Ukraine, apparently those aren't terrorists either if the West doesn't recognize it. So very ridiculous thing to say, but I want to get your thoughts on what actually happened with the Russians. We hear reports of these ships being taken over to the port in Libya, and then some people are saying that Russia is going to increase its support for Haftar. And I mean, from my perspective, if Russia actually was going to balance the power board on the Mediterranean, they would quickly topple the Tripoli government, which again, the Libya situation, the Tripoli-backed government there is, the government of national accord is supported by Turkey and Qatar, Muslim Brotherhood alliance, and Haftar, the Libyan National Army, which controls 70% or so of Libya, is supported by Russia. So that could be something that they're going to have to press on. But if they weren't willing to support Syria, I have no reason to believe that they would be willing to suddenly reignite the Libyan civil war and get that going. But I want to hear your thoughts, Dimitri, on what exactly is the Russian situation. What does their deck look like now that Syria has fallen? I want to know your thoughts on if Turkey was perhaps threatening them with the Dardanelles and Bosphorus Straits, because we know Strelkov, of course, back in 2018 and many other times in history, has warned about the dangers of collapse in Syria. He said, I'm not going to read the whole quote, but this is a long time ago. In 2018, he says, the time is getting closer when my oldest forecasts about the development of the situation in the Ukraine-Turkey-Syria connection will come true. For those who did not read and did not listen to me in 2015 to 16, I remind, point by point, my theses, which have never changed since then and have not become, in my opinion, less likely. Sooner or later, the Russian Federation will have to enter into a direct military clash with Turkey on the initiative of the latter. The fighting will take place in Syria, in the Transcaucasus, and on the Black Sea. And cutting in real quick, remember the prophecies of St. Philomenos and St. Gabriel of Georgia. This is exactly the same thing that they're talking about. So we have Orthodox Christian military analysts saying this, as well as Orthodox Christian prophets, and the analysis lines up, just making this very clear for World War Now listeners. The direct participation of large contingents of Turkish troops under the guise of volunteers, or even without such cover, in operations against our army in Ukraine and Crimea is not ruled out. The Turks will begin to move on to a direct open confrontation with the Russian Federation after they squeeze dry from the Kremlin's amazing people all the concessions that can be obtained peacefully. Then they will begin to put pressure on military force. The Turks will choose the moment of entry into the war, taking into account the maximum weakening of the military forces of the Russian Federation and the unpreparedness to repel Turkish aggression. The first stage will be the closure of the Bosphorus and Dardanelles for our fleet and supply ships delivering reinforcements to Syria. Erdogan might take this action to be implemented already this year. This will be followed by a series of armed provocations in Syria by the so-called armed opposition against our troops in order to expand the zone of control of the pro-Turkish authorities. After waiting for the depletion of ammunition and supplies, Turkish troops will try to inflict a complete defeat on our expeditionary force and Syrian troops in northern Syria. Naturally, only the Russian Federation and official Damascus will be blamed for the escalation of the conflict. Our expeditionary corps, cut off from the supplies and reinforcements, does not have the opportunity to defeat the Turkish army. The only thing that can deter the Turks, apart from the direct threat of the use of nuclear weapons, which is fraught with a world nuclear war, from defeating our troops in Syria is the direct intervention of Iran and its readiness to directly enter into a military confrontation with Turkey in Syria and the Transcaucasus. I remind you that Turkey is strenuously and now friends with the main opponent of Iran, Israel. In any case, even if Ankara does not dare to go into a full-scale military conflict with the Russian Federation, the Turks will strangle our grouping in Syria since all communications are based on sea supplies through Novorossiya to Tartus, and blocking the airspace with Syria is also not a problem for the Turks. The question of the timely withdrawal of our expeditionary force in Syria has long been overripe, but has not yet been raised as such. A large group of our military remains hostage to Erdogan. With a high probability, we can expect that the long-awaited rejection of the shameful and senseless grain deal will set in motion a chain of consequences that naturally leads to a sharp aggravation of Russian-Turkish relations and an acceleration of Turkey's inevitable transition to the camp of our open enemies. The time allotted for our possibility of evacuating our troops from Syria during the deal is apparently lost forever. So this is from, I believe, 2023 or 2022, and it rehashes a lot of his analysis that he had given in 2018. There's another post that says basically the same stuff without the details about the Ukraine war ongoing that he made in 2018. So what are your thoughts on this effectively prophetic, political prediction from our good friend Igor Strelkov-Gierkin?
No, absolutely. Look, Colonel Strelkov has made the utmost correct predictions over the last 10 years. We can say that hands down at this point. In fact, Vladimir Putin even essentially repeated Strelkov's statements at this press conference a couple of days ago, his famous press conference, which closed the year of 2024. And, not getting too deep into the details here, Vladimir Putin essentially openly stated that, well, we should have begun the SMO a few years earlier than 2022, which is exactly what Strelkov was saying for the last decade plus. And so at least we can tell now that Igor Strelkov was correct, not just on the Ukrainian end, but also in Syria. Now, Strelkov was very dovish. He was not very interested in Russia's commitment to Syria because he said that Russia was wasting time supporting an overseas regime. And essentially, Russia did go into Syria quite late. If you think about it, September 2014, as opposed to 2011 and 12, when the Assad regime was essentially asking for aid. We have media reports from the Russian Federation, Ministry of Foreign Affairs, actually, when there were questions asked, well, has Assad requested aid from Russia earlier than 2014? The answer was yes, and Russia refused to assist him. This is before, of course, the Assad regime lost 60 to 70% of the territory which it held, at the beginning of the civil war. So Russia, in fact, came to Syria late. But of course, now that it committed, and now that it's lost its kind of presence in Syria, we have to just conclude that this was, generally speaking, a failed Russian international operation. All in all, I don't see what Putin is pointing towards as a success because, well, if the destruction of ISIS was the goal, which it wasn't to begin with, the goal was to assist the government of Assad, which fell. So the primary objective, I think, seems somewhat dubious, I think, and definitely not achieved. I think we can even state that openly. There's a clip of Vladimir Putin from 2015, from the 9th of May parade. Of course, it's the victory parade, which takes place on the Red Square, where Putin very clearly, into the microphone himself, openly proclaims that Russia will be establishing 2 military bases, one in Khmeimim next to Latakia, this is the port in the eastern Mediterranean on Syrian territory, and one military base in Tartus. And these will be permanent bases, he says very clearly. Now we understand these bases may not even be permanent after such recent events. Of course, the future of these Russian bases are now in flux because it will depend upon Russia's temporary agreement with the new former al-Qaeda aligned government of Hayat al-Sham, which is led by Emir al-Jilani, which some people in the Russian Ministry of Foreign Affairs, for example, Mikhail Bogdanov, who is the left or the right-hand man of Lavrov, and of course, most of us have listened to the interview of Tucker Carlson and Lavrov. You can probably see the diplomatic approach which Lavrov has to giving speeches. You can see kind of dips and dives and essentially copy-paste essentially what Putin has said previously at interviews. I personally did not learn anything new, but I think that Tucker Carlson interview is worth listening to kind of understand the approach of the Russian Ministry of International Relations, essentially how it sort of conducts itself. But speaking about Mikhail Bogdanov, he's a famous Arabist in Russia. He can speak Arabic fluently. He's a former ambassador to Israel, former ambassador to Egypt. He's openly stated that the Russian government may seek to recognize HTS and the oppositionary forces in Syria as a legitimate government. So already the Russians, at least by saying Russians, I don't mean the Russian people, but the Russian government, the United Russia Party is folding all of its cards in terms of Syria. It's willing to take this loss and sort of make the most of it, in fact, or at least to save face in some capacity, whether it's rhetorical or actually even to keep these bases running. Perhaps, there's been some claims that maybe Russia will keep these bases running in order to provide humanitarian aid to the Syrian people, not as military bases, but simply as some sort of UN-aligned humanitarian bases going forward, which again is not very promising. Notice how the United States can actually keep tens and hundreds of bases abroad open, despite a sort of local opposition in Africa, Southeast Asia, the Pacific, all around the world, essentially surrounding Russia. But the Russian Federation, unfortunately, is unable to, or because of globalist pressure, is unable to keep even several of its bases functioning on foreign territory, right, through agreements with the local governments there. So there are lots of questions. I think the recent statements by Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen Republic, this is, of course, in the Northern Caucasus. We've all heard of Kadyrov recently. He's very famous on Instagram, despite the fact that Instagram is banned in Russia. Somehow Kadyrov keeps an open Instagram account. He's openly stated that he supports the Sunni takeover of HTS, and this is a blessing from Allah. And he personally will be supporting the new oppositionary Syrian government and its people by potentially providing them monetary aid. And he even offered to send some of his personal security detachment in order to support the government in Damascus. Now, if that's not a support of a globalist aligned government, I'm not sure what is, but Kadyrov is allowed to sort of make these proclamations without being pressured by, his superiors in Russia, because simply he has the freedom to do as he wills, right? Which is quite curious. And it also shows that the Sunni extremists in Russia, especially those in Ingushetia, Chechnya, Dagestan, we've seen them literally martyr people in recent terrorist acts, and we've seen all kinds of excesses, of course. And we've also seen the Ichkerian, Turkmeni, Central Asian migrants commit crimes in Syria and sort of work with HTS and work against the Assad government throughout the last 10 years during the Syrian civil war. These particular people all have a certain commonality. They are all Sunni Muslim, perhaps Wahhabi-aligned extremists who potentially do see Russia as a future enemy. And so Kadyrov's alignment with HTS is very peculiar, Conrad. It's very, I think, dangerous, because we have seen, going back to history, we've seen the Ottoman Empire fund all kinds of rebellions with the Cherkassians, Chechens, Ingushetians, and various Dagestani Sunni clans during the Russian imperial 1800s period, post-Napoleonic Wars, which is why Russia even engaged in these very serious and bloody and quite intense North Caucasus wars during the 19th century, during the reigns of Nicholas I, Alexander I, and Alexander II. So these wars last decades because the Ottoman Empire funded these Islamist groups. Now, will we see a similar occurrence take place in the future? Perhaps we will, because again, everything's kind of pointing towards these sort of things. But the Russian move of equipment to Libya, we've seen sort of confirmation from Western media sources. They're claiming that Russia disassembling their S-300, S-400 anti-air missile systems, all kinds of ground armaments, putting them on ships and shipping them over to their 4 military bases located in Libya, which is quite curious. This means Russians did in fact have very up-to-date anti-air missile systems located in these Russian bases. Of course they would, right? To defend themselves. And the question arises, why weren't these anti-air systems being used against Israeli warplanes, which were bombing the Russian ally, of course, the Syrian Arab Army and its bases over the last 12 months plus? Questions which we most likely won't receive any answers for. And lastly, I think it's worth mentioning the fact that Russia, throughout these events, we just have to concentrate that Russia did take an L. Russia has lost significant leverage in Syria. We do know HTS, the Syrian oppositionary forces, whether it's the Kurds or it's the Turkish-backed, this new Syrian oppositionary army, or it's the organization of HTS and all these former al-Qaeda members or even potentially former ISIS members who've joined HTS, right? These people are less aligned with Russia and more aligned with potentially Mossad, CIA. We know the Kurds are directly supported and aligned and backed by the United States, which is, again, an enemy of Russia. And the United States is backing the Ukrainian terrorist, Zionist, Talmudic regime in Kiev as well. And we know Turkey, which is directly backing HTS, is also a NATO state and has openly sort of proclaimed itself as an oppositionary country to this former Syrian Arab army And Russia has still not made any anti-Turkish statements, clearly. Last and not least, we've had literal Ukrainians on the ground actually supporting the taking of Aleppo. Ukrainian drone pilots, actually, I think it was between 20 and 30 personnel who were involved in this, in particular in flying these military drones. These are Ukrainian veterans who traveled down to support Turkey and HTS in their takeover of Assad's bases throughout, leading all the way up to Damascus. And yes, it's a small sort of contingent, but it does bring to mind the fact that Ukraine, Zelensky himself, the president of Ukraine, is sending his own personnel in order to support these NATO operations, because we can't forget Turkey, despite the fact that Erdogan may have his personal Islamic Sunni aspirations for potentially a future Ottoman rebirth, Turkey is still one of the leading and one of the most formidable NATO member states. So this was a NATO victory, right? It wasn't a victory of a Russian operation in Syria or of the taking down of ISIS. It was a NATO victory in Syria. It was also an Israeli victory. Israel is not a NATO country, but it's a NATO allied state similar to South Korea. South Korea is not a NATO country, but you can't say South Korea is an ally of Russia by any stretch of the imagination. So I think we have to just stay very sober and just provide not a pessimistic analysis, but simply kind of reflect on what has taken place over the last few weeks. And the fact is that Russia at the moment, Conrad, I think it's through Bogdanov, through Lavrov, through Maria Zakharova, the blonde spokesperson of the Ministry of International Affairs in Russia, they're simply attempting right now to diplomatically establish some sort of link with the new oppositionary government to potentially retain some of Russia's control over the leases and real estate, which Russia now still controls in Syria, these bases, which it invested over 10 years into. The statistics, again, that we've gathered is that Russia has invested between $20 and $40 billion in American USD into Syria over the last decade. And for Russia to lose these military bases, these defense establishments, would be even a greater blow. So at the moment, it's all about minimizing the damage, which will inevitably take place now that Syria has become this sort of bedrock of the globalist world order, whether or not, as you mentioned in the last episode, Conrad, whether or not it's the Zog-controlled future Sunni Turkish NATO caliphate, or it's the greater Israel project. Whoever wins here, or even a future Kurdistan supported by the US, whoever wins here, Russia will most likely not be the victor. And this is extremely dangerous, of course, moving into World War III prophecies by some of our Orthodox saints. This event it's been even more impactful than the October 7th event at the closing of 2023 last year. This is absolutely one of the cornerstones moving into next year as to exactly how the Syrian future scenario will play out. I think we'll be keeping a very close eye out on what takes place there.
I totally agree. And you talk about the Russian potential recognition of HTS. Of course, the U.S. State Department removed Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's leader al-Jilani from their most wanted list, including the $10 million bounty against him. And you mentioned the Chechens and all of that going on. We see as the Turkish incursion continues into Syria, the idea from this, and I believe this is why it's so important that the Russians get the Georgians back into their sphere of influence, is now all of Russia's southern flank is pretty much Turkish influence in some capacity, right? Syria falls to the Turks, Turkey proper in and of itself, Turkish forces in the Black Sea. We have the whole Tatar question that Turkey has invoked since 2022 to meddle in the situation in Ukraine, to assert that they want Crimea to be Ukrainian territory internationally. And then, of course, we have the Chechens and the Dagestanis and the Ingushetians, who are often, considered Turkic peoples. And again, if you loop them in together with the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Kyrgyz, these types of people, like specifically the Tajiks who were responsible for the Crocus City Hall terrorist attack. At what point are the Russians going to realize they have a Sunni Turkic-based army basically on their border that also happens to work for NATO? I mean, this is something that is just intolerable and that the Russians are going to have to wake up to. And the first thing they're going to have to do to wake up to this, and I'll loop this in when we talk about the Saudi terror attack at the German Christmas market, is they got to start deporting these non-whites. I mean, that's just one of the, if these people are already also infiltrating their major cities, then that's going to be a major issue. And of course, we know that the Russian-Turkish war is going to be the bloodiest front in the eventual really hot Third World War. But some geopolitical phenomenon that could occur in that I think are becoming very interesting. We discussed this in the episode with GSP and Isaac, and reports are coming in that after the 4-day ceasefire between Turkey and the US-backed Kurdish SDF, who support PKK and YPG forces in the region, apparently Turkey has completely denied that that's been continuing, and there's effectively just been clashes overtly. So US proxies are clashing with Turkey. And if the Russians wise up and realize that what I just described as this growing Turkish belt to their south we could see a future where perhaps Russia does back the Kurds, and we see U.S.-Russian interests aligning again in Syria. And again, the prophecies talk about a future greater Kurdistan and expanded Armenia. And, off air, Dimitri, we were talking about how we could see a future where Turkey is fighting against an Armenia, Kurdish, Greek alliance, and, somehow Russia gets in there. And you could think of all sorts of scenarios where Turkey gets kicked out of NATO, Turkey stays in NATO, the US leaves NATO. How could the factionalism change if all of those things go down? But the fact that we even see a potential for Russian support of Kurds in the region shows that the prophecies about the Russo-Turkish war and the drift that direction have been more than spot on. And obviously, Strelkov's analysis shows that realpolitik people, military analysis, people have had these predictions, as well as our clairvoyant elders who know these things for no other reason than their noetic foresight. But we have to move on to the situation just a little bit south in Palestine at the war with Israel there. The ceasefire in Lebanon continues to be violated, obviously, but a really big escalation. Obviously, strikes continue in Gaza as well, but the militarization and mobilization of Hamas-aligned and Islamic militant forces in the West Bank is increasing. The Palestinian Authority, Fatah, clearly is not doing much to resist the ever-expanding annexation attempts in the West Bank. So this is from Ramallah. Palestinian officials said Israeli forces killed 6 people in the occupied West Bank on Thursday, while the Israeli military confirmed it killed 4 militants in an airstrike. There are reports that one of the 2 other people that weren't militants in the strike was an 80-year-old woman. So that's what is getting left out here. But the clashes between militant groups and the Palestinian Authority, as well as settler groups, is continuing to expand. And unfortunately, it seems that I don't know how Hamas is exactly faring completely in Gaza. I know their headquarters are still in Qatar. I don't know if any of these groups, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, have the wherewithal to actually take over the Palestinian Authority, take over the West Bank. I really don't know the exact situation on the ground there, but I want to get your thoughts on everything going on in Lebanon and in the West Bank and Gaza before we move on to Russia, because the only people at this point that are standing up are the Houthis. I mean, Hezbollah is doing what they can, but obviously their supply chains in Syria have been very dramatically reduced. And Ansar Allah, they're launching cruise missiles, ballistic missiles at Tel Aviv. They're getting touchdowns and everything. But anytime there's a strike that actually touches down the U.S. and Israel with their strikes on Sana'a and these other parts in Hodeidah, these other major important parts to the Yemeni Houthi forces, they strike those huge. So these aren't tit for tat. This is, destructive fire and brimstone from the Western forces. And the Houthis are just throwing whatever they can, hoping they get through to try to give some relief to the Gazans. But in the Red Sea, this is a recent report that came out while we were recording. This is from Ram Navarim. Earlier today, the USS Gettysburg Ticonderoga-class guided missile destroyer accidentally shot down a U.S. Navy FA-18 Super Hornet twin-seat multi-role fighter jet launched by the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier with a single SM-2 ship-to-surface-to-air missile. Both the pilot and his weapons systems operator safely ejected, with one of the occupants sustaining minor injuries. So, again, the Houthis, they're maintaining frame despite these enormous strikes that haven't been able to topple them in Sana'a. They're launching strikes at Israel, and they're causing such a confusing deployment of ships in the Red Sea that they are apparently shooting each other out of the sky. So, again, the Houthis being the boldest and most going all in, I guess, for lack of a better expression, the most intense node of the resistance. Obviously, they still do have supply chains from Iran, but they seem to be doubling their efforts now that they know that the rest of the axis has been very substantially damaged.
Yeah, no, the bombardment by the Houthis of Israel in recent weeks has been exceptionally impressive, I would say, from a military perspective. And even the recent bomb that hit Tel Aviv, I mean, that missile flew over 2,000 kilometers. If you can just imagine the distance, that's 3 times the distance of the Areshnik, which fell on some industrial toilet next to Dnipro. And that was apparently the biggest news of the week at the end of November there, which we covered in such detail. But the Houthis are literally shooting what can be described as nearly mid-range, mid-continental level missiles all the way to Israel, and successfully so. I mean, they've injured 15 Israelis or so, not necessarily striking Israeli bases effectively, but striking at Israel's pride and sort of showing them that the axis is not broken, despite the fact that Assad's Arab sovereign Syria has in fact fallen to this globalist coalition, in fact, with Turkey and Israel playing the major roles there. But the Houthis, these recent strikes and the retaliation by Israel does show that Israel is in fact looking to completely cut the axis in half. In fact, on the southern end in Yemen, near the Red Sea, and of course on the northern end, that massive crescent of the axis of resistance, of course, which the middle part of which is Syria, which is now essentially all but defunct, and in fact kind of in its last dying breaths. But it's very interesting how both Israel strikes Yemen at the beginning of the week, and then of course those strikes are followed up by the UK and by the UK Air Force using US aircraft carriers, as well as the United States Air Force. And they've killed at least 20 plus Yemenis already. There's reports of death from all these strikes, in fact. But overall, I think these strikes do show that the interests of Israel, the interests of the globalist NATO powers, because we have to understand UK and NATO, the UK and the US are NATO's countries, right? So, I mean, for those listening from Russia and from other nations, NATO essentially for them is this terrorist organization. Well, this is exactly who the Yemenis, Houthis are fighting against, right? These are the same enemies of Russia as are those who are fighting against Russia in Ukraine at the moment. So essentially the Houthis are Russian allies in all but name. So it's quite curious to see them sort of fight whilst groups such as Hezbollah in southern Lebanon are extremely bloodied. The Israeli bombardment of Lebanon until the ceasefire in November was essentially unprecedented. Even 2006 did not see, and 2005, that particular war between Lebanon and Israel did not see such an extreme casualty rate of just civilian Lebanese people, as well as members of Hezbollah, especially the Hezbollah leadership. So we can't really blame Hezbollah for pulling out and sort of going along with the ceasefire. Mind you, the ceasefire has not essentially ended the clashes between Israel and Hezbollah, but it has softened them to quite a major extent. I would say the clashes have been reduced by like 80%, perhaps even more. And Israel has stopped progressing further north up to the river in Lebanon, essentially taking these Hezbollah trenches and bases. So the ceasefire, again, is unsuccessful, but it may be very similar to the Minsk II agreements, which didn't necessarily stop Ukraine from bombing Donetsk and Lugansk. So in some ways, it was a success, but only a temporary one. We'll see if this ceasefire progresses. At the same time, Conrad, you did mention the Gaza Strip. Every day almost, you can see stories in the media. For example, just a day ago, 16 people were killed in the Gaza Strip in one of the North Gaza hospitals, which Israel again bombed from the air. So this is in North Gaza, which is, you can say, even more under Israeli control than probably you can say central or southern Gaza. So the Israelis continue the genocide of the Palestinians. The casualty rate is, as Isaac Swalem on episode 99 mentioned, is probably over 200,000 at this point from malnutrition, bombardment, and all kinds of other deaths of civilians. It's probably quite extreme, right? Probably unseen since maybe the time of the Second World War in terms of whole percentage of the particular population. It's quite tragic for the Palestinian people that they're still experiencing this intense bombardment, despite the fact that Hamas itself has been, I think, to some extent weakened over the last year, but they're still, of course, fighting on. And Hamas personally, there are still spokespersons, as you said, in Qatar and some of these other places who are speaking out against Israel. So the sort of fight of the Axis against the Israeli Zionists continues, and we see the Yemenis Houthis kind of leading that as Syria falls. And Iran itself has, again, I think it was a couple of days ago, has first commented that the axis of resistance is not broken. In fact, I think we've mentioned this with Syrian Girl, but the axis of resistance, it could be seen as a crescent, essentially aligning Hamas, Hezbollah, Syria, and Iran. But now the crescent has been essentially flipped upside down. And you have Iran, of course, the Yemenis, Houthis, Hamas, and Hezbollah. So the crescent has been switched to a more Houthi-centric Yemen focus rather than what's happening in Syria at the moment, where I think the greatest consideration we have here, Conrad, is that Hezbollah was receiving armaments from Iran through Syria. And now that that transition middleman point has been breached, there's no particular way that Hezbollah can receive these future armaments and shipments from Iran. And so I think that's one of the major considerations as to why the Assad regime was aimed at by both the Turkish NATO coalition as well as these HTS, perhaps potentially pro-Zionist factions, and Israel itself. And this is why Syria was such a major enemy, I think, to the Israelis, to the Zionists, and to the anti-Axis movement, was because of that supply of Hezbollah and the resistance to the Zionists in southern Lebanon. And we know that Hezbollah fought ferociously for the Assad regime exactly for this purpose. And now that the Assad regime has fallen, all the Hezbollah veterans have returned to Lebanon, and now they're essentially licking their wounds, essentially reestablishing themselves potentially for some sort of further escalation after the ceasefires, of course, complete themselves. And, this entire process, we've seen never-ending stop to the warfare and the death of civilians, I think, from all angles, Lebanese people, Palestinians, and even a small minority of Israelis who have died in the fighting. And again, the main culprit in all of this, the Benjamin Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, and those in his cabinet have been essentially not found guilty, have not been brought to justice. So we kind of see who is behind all of this, but at the same time, there does not seem to be any sort of mechanism to bring the culprits of all this bloodshed to answer for their crimes.
No, it's really unfortunate that these people might end up living full and happy lives and dying peacefully in their sleep. But thankfully, Netanyahu, he's stressing a little bit. He's not going to get to go to the Polish Auschwitz yearly memorial because he's afraid of arrest by the ICC. So that's at least, a little bit of a damage to the Zog agenda is happening there. We're going to maybe talk a little bit about that more when we talk about the European situation. And I want to give one last piece of Middle Eastern news before we move on to Russia, because we got to get moving on here. But there was news that broke this week that apparently Saudi Arabia had reneged on its commitment to a Palestinian state and said that it would move forward with recognizing Israel and the talks in that direction without guarantees, and just say that it would hope to move towards a Palestinian state eventually. But this was quickly debunked by Saudi and Israeli media. The Saudis were like, no, we didn't say anything like this. Our commitment to a Palestinian state is very, very strong. So, that was an attempt at, I don't know which Jewish media group was behind trying to foment that, but it got nipped in the bud very quickly. The UAE is continuing to throw its weight around, but we're going to really talk about that more when we talk about some of this Africa stuff in a second, but we have to talk about Russia. So, Dimitri, what is going on in Russia? We saw a drone hit this Kazan skyscraper. We have reports that apparently oil through Ukraine from Russia is going to start not flowing anymore. We have the Financial Times saying that Trump is claiming that aid to Ukraine will continue under his administration. So all of these developments are huge, of course. So break those down and then tell us what exactly is going on the front lines as well.
Yeah, I think the biggest news story, of course, which only took place yesterday, the smashing of 2 Ukrainian drones into a skyscraper in Kazan. This is where the BRICS summit took place, by the way, in October, which we all recall. That was one of the biggest news stories of this year, and which went successfully sort of commenced, and which saw so many countries participate, and which saw, of course, the Turkish membership to BRICS actually get declined by India, which I think will play an important geopolitical role into the future of international relations. And we've mentioned it then, but we need to highlight that. So Turkey is being excluded from any future potential alliance with Russia. But Kazan itself, it's a major city. It's located next to famous cities such as Stalingrad, Astrakhan, essentially you can say central Russia on the far east of European Russia, not quite in Siberia, but 1,000 kilometers away from the front lines. And yet we see several Ukrainian drones, 3 or 4 of them were shot down by Russian anti-air, but 2 of them smashed into a building. There were several people injured, but at the moment, there are no reports of any casualties. Maria Zakharova from the Ministry of International Relations of the Russian Federation has announced. And these sort of terrorist long-range drone strikes, they're showing us that Ukraine is also capable of very long-range strikes with simply what seems to be very primitive, slow-flying drones, as opposed to these mid-range ballistic missiles, which can have a nuclear warhead on them, like the Oreshnik, which we saw earlier this year. So it's quite somewhat amusing when the geopolitical sort of, I want to say, uncritical patriots call out Ukraine for not being capable of conducting themselves in a sort of warlike manner. When Ukraine is successfully striking various bases of Russia and various interest points, I mean, at this point, this civilian building that was struck was, again, not a military target. So this is an act of Ukrainian terrorism, if anything, right, against the civilian population. But it does show that there's really no city in Russia that's safe from Ukrainian espionage. And this kind of plays towards it goes kind of hand in hand with the assassination of the Russian general Igor Kirillov. The point about the assassination of General Kirillov is that he was the most senior Russian official to have died from the beginning of the SMO, besides, of course, Yevgeny Prigozhin himself. But I think we can say, without sort of going into the details of Yevgeny Prigozhin's demise, that most likely he wasn't killed by Ukrainians, right? But General Kirillov was, and his assistant officer, Ilya, were killed in a terrorist bombing outside of his home apartment in a not very prestigious suburb of Moscow. It's frankly surprising that a member, like a deputy minister of defense, a person of such high ranking in the Ministry of Russian Defense, is even housed without proper security clearance. But he was killed by essentially a bomb which was attached to a scooter, and the scooter was located outside of his apartment. As he left to go to work in the morning, the scooter exploded, killing him and his assistant Ilya in the event. I believe both of them were Orthodox Christians. Ilya was buried in his home village, while the General Kirillov was buried actually in the Mытищ military famous cemetery. Of course, this is where Mikhail Kalashnikov was buried and all these other famous Russian Soviet military generals and field marshals, those who served during the Second World War. And I mean, this particular graveyard is quite famous because, again, Yevgeny Prigozhin and Colonel Utkin were also buried there. What's curious is that at the funeral itself, you had the former Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, present, and of course, Belousov, the current Minister of Defense, were also there. But Vladimir Putin was absent from the funeral, from the Orthodox funeral of General Kirillov, which does sort of bring to question perhaps it wasn't necessarily safe, and the Russian defense, the FSB, are just not sure whether or not these terror strikes will continue. The other thing is the man who actually planted the bomb on the scooter in the first place was a Dagestani legal immigrant. His Russian was extremely broken. He spoke with a heavy accent. He said that he was paid by some unknown person that he would have to stick this bomb on the scooter, time it, blow it up, kill the general, and he would be paid 100,000 American dollars and be given some sort of EU, like an EU visa or a citizenship for one of the European Union countries. Now, it reminds me of the Crocus City Hall, where those particular Tajik terrorists were also told by some secret imam on Telegram that they would be paid a certain amount of money if they committed this terrorist strike. But it's quite curious, when he's being interrogated, this Uzbek terrorist, that he kind of says all of this very nonchalantly without any sort of remorse whatsoever, as if it's just a casual transaction or that he was hired for a particular job like a contract. And again, it brings to mind, Conrad, this recent Saudi Arabian liberal terror strike in Germany as well, where he drove his car through the Christmas parade. Why are these people even in these European countries such as Russia, these sort of non-Russians, regardless of their religious affiliation? They're simply the fact that they cannot assimilate, even morally speaking and culturally, to the particular Christian host countries really shows you that at any point they could be recruited, or they can simply go crazy by the fact that they come from a different social background. Again, the dangers are very obvious, and we've spoken out against mass immigration in the past, but we do have to keep in mind that Russia has officially stated that Ukraine was behind General Kirillov's death, and this was the most senior member of the Russian Federation to be killed to date, actually. So it's extremely significant. It's not similar to the death of Vladlen Tatarsky or Daria Dugina, who was simply a writer and a journalist. This was the death of a very high-ranking general who was also in charge of the chemical warfare investigations that Russia was doing and conducting on the Ukrainian biolabs, which made a lot of media storm, especially in the US in the post-COVID SMO, which again, with the post-Faucian focus on exactly what the US is funding in overseas chemical laboratories, became very popular. So again, General Kirillov's death raises questions as to what exactly he knew and why he was a prime target for the Ukrainian special forces and why they hired this Dagestani terrorist to carry this strike out. So on the front lines, however, Russia's made significant improvements and progress in the Chernigovskoye Oblast long-range bombardments. Russia's potentially looking to enter into the Chernigovskoye Oblast. This is north of Kursk, in order to make a surround of the Ukrainian contingent in Kursk. And for the first time, Russian developments in Kursk are being reflected in Western media. The Western media sources are openly proclaiming that, well, potentially the Russian standing in Kursk is improving, and maybe by the middle of 2025, the Ukrainians will be forced out of Kursk in their entirety, because they've already lost more than half of the territory which they took earlier this year. And now the Russians are seemingly making intense progress. Mind you, the main city of Kursk, which the Ukrainians captured in Sudzha, is still being held by the Ukrainians. They're holding on to it. This, of course, aligns with the other story you mentioned, with the Russians potentially closing all the oil and gas pipelines and, of course, the shipments into Ukraine, right? So the oil shipments from Ukraine, which take place, and the gas supply, which again, Russia should have shut down the supply of energy earlier at the beginning of the SMO in order to, again, bring Ukraine out of the war 2.5 years ago, as opposed to right now. But better late than never. Hopefully certain actions will be taken in this direction, right? We can only hope, in order to avoid further bloodshed, potentially even to pressure Ukraine to not further persecute the church. We have to keep this in mind. And further progress, of course, is made towards the key city of Pokrovsk. Again, there are reports that Russia will be commencing the siege of Pokrovsk in the next few weeks, potentially even before Christmas, maybe before the 1st of January. But again, what exactly this means, Pokrovsk is a major city. Russia hasn't taken a city of this size since Mariupol and since Kherson. So whether or not we're looking at a siege the size of Bakhmut, or maybe like a quick victory like in Kherson, where Russia dropped off these aerial commandos and took Kherson relatively in a bloodless fashion. I'm not too sure, but in any case, we know Pokrovsk has many Orthodox churches and has several monasteries as well located on its outskirts. So we just hope that these Orthodox Christian sites of pilgrimage and worship are not damaged in the coming fighting, which we know will be intense because the Ukrainians and the Zelensky regime is trying their best to hold on to some of these key cities, because we know Toretsk even. The Russians took half of Toretsk, but the Ukrainians are still fighting back. The same is happening in Kupiansk in the north of the Donetsk Oblast. We know Kupiansk is next to Kramatorsk and Slavyansk. The Ukrainians are ferociously holding it and sending in more and more reinforcements. Essentially, some are claiming that essentially they're being sent in into a meat grinder, but this is General Commander Syrski's sort of signature move. He was called the Butcher of Bakhmut for a reason, because he simply sent tens of thousands of Ukrainians to die against Wagner and Bakhmut over and over again throughout the entirety of last year, 2023. So we know Ukrainians are very famous for sort of disregarding the lives of their own men, regardless of their religion or anything of that sort, which again most likely plays into that future new Khazaria scenario where the male population of Ukraine will be depopulated, sort of artificially and forcefully smashed against the Russian advances, which are making significant progress. The only place where Russia has not made progress at the moment, Conrad, is of course Chasiv Yar, which has essentially stabilized to an almost pause, and Russia has stopped progressing in that particular direction. So I think all eyes are on the major city of Pokrovsk at the moment. And I think essentially if Pokrovsk falls, they're saying that the next particular city in that direction that the Russians can be progressing towards is, of course, the famous city of Zaporozhye. And after that, Dnipropetrovsk, which again is the head city of the Ukrainian Jews, and that's where the largest Jewish center of all of Ukraine is located. Now, the only bad news I need to mention on the Russian end is that on the 5th of December, the governor of the Kursk Oblast, and we need to mention Kursk because, again, this particular oblast is where Ukraine is holding significant Russian territories. The governor of Kursk has been replaced, and the previous governor, Alexei Smirnov, has been fired. The new governor of the Kursk Oblast is a Chabad Lubavitch Jew, and he's not an Orthodox Christian. He's a big-nosed member of the Talmudic tribe, but a very fervent member of United Russia. This is Alexander Hinstein. And for those not familiar with him, perhaps you're like, oh, well, who is this Alexander Hinstein character? There's a very famous clip going around Twitter and Telegram, and I'm sure we've posted it before in the past, where Vladimir Zhirinovsky, the former sort of center-right leader of Russia, is debating on Vladimir Shapiro Solovyov's show, and he's basically yelling at his opponent in this debate that he's calling him a Jew, and the other man is saying, well, I'm going to take you to court for these anti-Semitic statements. And this particular funny clip that went around and kind of went viral, Zhirinovsky is actually debating with Hinstein, who is now the new governor of Kursk. So was it a good idea to promote Hinstein to the position of governor of Kursk? I'm not sure. I'm not sure who made that decision. Was it Medvedev? Was it Putin? Was it the Speaker of the Russian Duma? In any case, I think it's probably blackmailing, because we do understand who is behind the entire Ukraine-Russian war to begin with, and even the revolution which took place in Ukraine. And just to mention really briefly, certain Russian journalists have made the analogy of Ukraine falling to the Maidan and the Assad government also falling to its own, this HTS-led Maidan. I think those analogies are somewhat incorrect, but they also show the fact that, well, Russia really needs to step up its sort of presence and soft power and even hard power application in overseas nations, because NATO forever will be fighting these proxy wars in countries like Ukraine, Syria, Georgia against Russian interests. So I think we can all see the sort of grip of death surrounding the Russian Federation at the moment as it's emerging and evolving into this future Orthodox Christian version of itself. Perhaps it's a re-emergence, we hope, according to the prophecies of the saints as well, this re-emergence of the Orthodox Christian Russian Empire. These forces of the globalist demons are essentially trying to strangle it in its cradle before it sort of reemerges into its future self. So I think this is why we're seeing Russian influence suppressed all around the globe, regardless of exactly what kind of form that influence can take, whether or not it's peaceful humanitarian basis or if it's just soft presence in Ukraine prior to the Maidan. And I think that we need to keep that in mind. It's not just about Russia seeking to dominate its neighbors or dominate these overseas countries such as Syria or Libya. It's simply because Russia is retaliating and pushing back against the chokehold that it's in and that it has been in since 1991, since the dissolution of the USSR.
No, I completely agree. And before we move on to some of those other countries in the Russian periphery like Georgia and Romania that you were mentioning, you mentioned the new head of the Kursk region, and we have to mention, I think, Putin's recent speech in regards
Mm-hmm.
to this topic. And I think to understand how it's being received internationally, I think the Times of Israel headline, this really helps portray how world Jewry is responding to this. They say, reviving anti-Semitic trope. Putin says Jews are tearing apart Russian Orthodox Church. And the subheader is, comments made during press conference echo Soviet-era anti-Semitism under Stalin, when the Kremlin persecuted Jews and accused them of being rootless cosmopolitans. And this is, of course, in reference to a section of Putin's very long 4-hour end-of-year speech that we have been referencing many times. And the main part that is getting so much attention is this quote, when Putin said, these people that are attacking the church, they are not atheists. They are absolutely faithless people, godless people. Well, ethnically, many of them are Jews, but you haven't seen them visit any synagogue. These people without kin or memory, with no roots, they don't cherish what we cherish, and the majority of the Ukrainian people cherish as well. And so obviously this is based, and, he's almost there. He's like 80% of the way there. He's like there for a boomer. I don't understand why you think going to a synagogue would suddenly make these people behave well. I mean, we know what happens at the synagogue. They curse the Virgin Mary. They curse Christians for even reading the last prophecies of Daniel because of what they prophesy. But regardless, the fact that he is aware of Jewish power is impressive for a world leader at this level, and it shows that he's confident enough, frankly, in his own personal security to say something like this. I think that's one of the most revealing things there. But I think the reality of this is that, as people have said before, we talked about this with Charles on our Ether Hour with him, even though there are certain Soviet-era, World War II-era laws that make Russia resemble somewhat of a European country in regards to its attitude on World War II and these Talmudic people, anti-Semitism, for lack of a better word, is ultimately part of the Russian DNA at this point, and there's just no escaping it. No matter how entrenched in World War II mythology you get, there's just no getting around the fact that the Jews are the civilizational enemy of Russia, the Russian Empire, and the Russian Federation. But unless you have any thoughts on that, Dmitry, obviously I think one thing that needs to happen in Ukraine is Russia needs to really get control over the Kursk region quickly and start building defensive fortifications, unlike, of course, what the Syrian Arab army did in Syria, because as much as Russia is advancing, Putin seems still remiss to want to do a full mobilization, and we know that with this news that Trump is going to continue funding the Ukrainian war effort, that there is a very strong chance eventually Ukraine will be able to mount future counteroffensives. And if they're still struggling in Kursk, that's not something that I think they want to be dealing with. So that's my advice there. But unless you have any thoughts on that, I have to talk about Georgia and Romania. Of course, Kavelashvili is the new Georgian president, Mikhail Kavelashvili, who's replaced Salome Zurabashvili, who has claimed that she's going to stay in office regardless, effectively doing a coup in and of itself. She's had to walk back comments claiming, we never called for violence, we never called for revolution. And even though protests are ongoing in Georgia, we know that they've pretty much died down, and it's clear that I don't know what she's going to do. I don't know if she's going to have to flee, if they're going to do a whole government in exile the way they do with Belarus. That wouldn't surprise me, but I think the Georgian Dream Party has securely maneuvered this color revolution to stay within, to maintain frame, and to keep the Georgian people, the Georgian Orthodox people first, and ultimately drift back into the Russian sphere of influence, which I view as positive. The news, of course, in Romania, obviously there's not been a huge update on any future elections as Georgescu continues to be completely canceled and boxed out. But this is from Eurasia Daily. The headline says Georgescu's TikTok campaign was not paid by the Russians, but often a lot of the election-related TikTok stuff was paid for by the majority party that is in power now, by the president who canceled the election to begin with, the first round. So all of these claims of social media interference are all total nonsense, and even mainstream sources are having to admit at this point. So what are your thoughts on all of these developments in the Russian periphery, Dmitry?
What's happening in Romania is further proof that as Orthodox countries progress in this sort of enlightenment and return to tradition, that they need to do away with this sort of democratic system of operation. Because again, elections are easily manipulatable. And we can see that money, media attention, and just simply the courts themselves are these institutions and these leverages, which again dismantle any ability of the people to actually choose the best candidates for these particular elections. I mean, Georgescu, personally speaking, he seemed to be quite an admirable character who at the moment is completely sidelined, and being blamed, again, accused of being pro-Russian, exactly in the same fashion as Zurabashvili, the former president of Georgia, and all these other liberal Georgians are accusing of any sort of I guess, center-right, you can say, or right-wing Georgians of being Russian puppets. It's the same approach. It's non-critical at this point. Even Viktor Orban is being called a Russian puppet, despite the fact that Viktor Orban is a very sort of independent and sort of acting personality. I think the reality of all these various elections taking place around Eastern Europe and even Georgia itself is that Russia presents itself as this sort of pole, this axis of, not axis of resistance, so to speak. That would be quite the plagiarism, but it's an axis of political opposition to this EU LGBTQ cultural model that's being enforced by these left-wing countries and the left-wing elites. And so even Fico, for example, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, will be visiting Putin in the next few weeks, probably before the 1st of January. And these sort of announcements, they do paint this future for at least Europe. If you want to be more right-wing, more conservative for your respective country, you need to align yourself with Russia in some capacity without certainly becoming a client state. But again, you do need to keep in mind your opposition, either your Georgescu or your Herakli Kobachidze, for example, the Prime Minister of Georgia, you'll be accused of being a Russian puppet. And even Donald Trump, we know that through the 2016 election process, he was being accused of directly being supported by the Russian Federation, which wasn't the case. Donald Trump was certainly supported by other international peoples and elites, but it certainly wasn't the Russians. So it's quite curious that this is still the talking point. I think various elites in Europe need to prepare for that reality. And hopefully the Romanian situation, as we sort of follow it closely, as complex as it is, it kind of resolves itself in favor of a more Orthodox Christian representation in the government. Because Romania at the moment, we have to reiterate, is an occupied country. It's not independent. The church itself has been essentially pressured very, very heavily, similar to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of Metropolitan Onufry, into essentially supporting the status quo government of the EU and NATO. We just have to keep this in mind. In a similar situation, I have to mention the Patriarch of Antioch, for example, will be also pressured. So do not feel despair or depression for those of you who follow the media. Now that the Assad government, the Arab sovereign people, that government has fallen in Syria, do not be surprised if certain bishops of the Antiochian Orthodox Church do call for peace and some sort of, not a Christian lukewarmness, but for Christians to essentially not oppose some sort of Sunni government taking power in Syria simply because there is no alternative and because they want to protect their own flock. And this is not Sergianism or any sort of heresy. It's simply how the church conducts itself in moments of political occupation. We saw this in the USSR. We see this in Ukraine. Nobody's calling Metropolitan Onufry a traitor to, for example, Orthodox interests. This is simply the church. The bishops have to make these difficult decisions. The church does not support some sort of hardcore revolution or rebellion when there's simply, in these particular cases, there's no fruitful reason to even do so. In fact, I think in Romania, Conrad, we can clearly say that the majority of the political elites are still not very much aligned with their sort of Orthodox roots of that sort of Kodriana right-wing, maybe even monarchist tradition that emerged and that created Romania in the 19th century in the first place. Like, they're very much still aligned with the EU and NATO, and I think the Romanian Orthodox Church, this is why it's taking a very neutral position on the whole political process. Perhaps this will have negative fruits into the future. Maybe hierarchs need to have a more open involvement in the political process. But that's not for me to say. I just think it's a very difficult choice to make. The church can either remain neutral or can speak out in favor of a more right-wing government for Romania in the coming elections. I think the church is an independent sort of organization, one of the jurisdictions of the Orthodox Universal Catholic Synodal Apostolic Church, can make these sort of proclamations. I think it's entirely possible, it's feasible. We have good precedent from the saints and through our elders for that. And I think it's up to the Orthodox Church of Romania, I think, to make this final decision. Maybe it'll break the stalemate that we see at the moment with the judges fighting against the parliamentarians and people, supporting Georgescu, not really finding any sort of support elsewhere. Maybe the church will be there, but perhaps I'm being a bit hopeful. But going forward, I think that's one of the black swan events that could take place in Romania. Perhaps the church will support either the status quo NATO EU angle, or maybe they'll support a more right-wing reversion to the tradition, as we see in maybe countries like Georgia with Patriarch Ilya.
We can only hope so. I think it's obvious with how much more pro-Orthodox Georgescu is than any other candidate in recent Romanian history. The choice would seem obvious. But again, I'm sure there's a lot of corruption, and I'm sure they are afraid of reprisal. And 2025 is the year the largest Orthodox church, the tallest church in the world, the People's Salvation Cathedral in Romania opens. So maybe that can usher in some grace, and there can be some political fallout from that as well. But we have to move on to some of these other disastrous election situations across Europe. Romania, obviously the most egregious, but Germany being the major player here that everybody has their eyes on. This is from CNN. Germany, Europe's largest economy, and normally a pillar of stability, is facing snap elections next year after Chancellor Olaf Scholz lost a vote of confidence. His government collapsed in November in a budget dispute, but his coalition had been unsteady for months. Scholz lost the vote, which he called himself as a step towards securing an early national election, with 394 ballots against him, 207 in his favor, and 116 abstentions. With the election date set for February 23rd next year, here's what's at stake. And this is from CNN, of course, and it's going to talk about how the CDU, the Christian Democratic Union, and their ally, the Christian Social Union, are the sort of the biggest center-right group. And then the Social Democrats, which is Scholz's party, they have the alliance with the Greens and are doing all of that. But of course, we know that the quote-unquote far-right alternative for Germany have been the ones that are storming in, and they're the second largest party in the country. And Elon Musk has recently thrown his support behind them. And I think if the AfD can finally break through and start winning any substantial or noticeable number of constituencies in Western Germany and expand the almost totalizing domination they have over Eastern Germany and expand that, then that's going to be a really good sign for them and proof that their victory is pretty much inevitable. But another country facing collapse, of course, is France. This is from MSN. It says, France's President Emmanuel Macron named François Bayrou as his new prime minister to run his government on Friday. His office said after his previous choice for the role served the shortest term in modern French history amid an entrenched political crisis. Macron appointed Bayrou after Michel Barnier was ousted last week in a no-confidence vote in France's National Assembly, prompted by budget cuts, tax raises aimed at cutting France's enormous deficit, and clashing centrist right and left-wing visions over how to fix France's divided society. So a big thing in France is nobody wants to impose austerity despite the fact that they ultimately need to. And the largest right-wing opposition being Le Pen and the National Rally, they are, many accuse them of being right-wing socialists, so they have no interest in taking the political fallout from cutting entitlements, which is extremely unpopular in France. People love their gibs and they love their protests, so that's how that goes. But nobody's going to want to do that, so there's going to be all this weird political fallout here. So goes on, Bayrou, like Barnier, is a political centrist. It wasn't immediately clear why Macron believes Bayrou will have more luck making progress with France's deadlocked National Assembly. Bayrou is Macron's fourth prime minister in a year. Macron himself is halfway through his second term. So again, this is all shaping up for, I know the National Rally will want to keep this energy up into the future elections to totally have a victory at the presidential level. But again, I think they need to get rid of Le Pen if they really want to win. Clearly, she is overstayed her welcome at the leadership in that party. There's just no purpose behind it. And the other major country we have to cover as this collapse pretty much continues is, of course, the Canada situation. Mm-hmm. We know that Trudeau's finance minister resigned. People were speculating the large amounts of members of his cabinet were totally not confident in him. So there's talk of no confidence measures and all these sorts of things. And this is a headline here. Trudeau government on brink of collapse as former ally of NDP's Jagmeet Singh backs no confidence motion. So for those that don't know, they're the third largest party in Canada. The NDP, they're like the super leftists. They're even more liberal than, the Liberal Party. And they're led by the Sikh guy, Jagmeet Singh, who's always kind of been an ally of Trudeau in the past. They've kind of needed them to stave off any conservative majority. And the article goes on to say Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, despite weathering months of political upheaval, appears poised to lose power early next year, well ahead of the federal election scheduled for October 2025. The shift comes as Jagmeet Singh, leader of the New Democratic Party and a crucial Trudeau ally, has announced plans to withdraw support in the parliament. Singh revealed plans to introduce a no-confidence motion in the House of Commons on 27th of January after the winter recess. He declared that the Liberal government does not deserve another chance. No matter who is leading the Liberal Party, this government's time is up, he said. Justin Trudeau failed in the biggest job a prime minister has, to work for people, not the powerful. The NDP will vote to bring this government down and give Canadians a chance to vote for a government who will work for them. Trudeau's prospects of surviving the no-confident votes are slim, as the Bloc Québécois, for those that don't know, that's a party that is surging at the national level. I think they get 7+% of the vote, and it's just a Québécois nationalist party, which had previously registered triggering an early election, has now pledged its support for the motion. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre addressing supporters reported Addressing reporters shortly after Singh's announcement, criticized the NDP leader's remarks. He noted that since recent confident votes, 3 major developments had occurred, 2 involving shifts in stance by Singh and Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet regarding their support for the Liberals. Polyev said he suddenly has an epiphany and says he can no longer support the costly chaos that he has enabled as part of the NDP Liberal coalition. So what's happening is the NDP realizes that the Liberal Party is a sinking ship and they're just, trying to get on top of that as soon as they can. But this major liberal collapse around the world is fascinating. Obviously, we saw Trudeau try to get ahead of this and push major immigration reform because we realize that is what's frustrating so many Canadians is just the tide of Indians and Africans and other people into Canada. But Keir Starmer, who is facing less political pressure than these guys we just said, he's doing the same thing in Britain. He realized that since the Conservative Party in the UK had embraced the Great Replacement just as much as them, he could get ahead of it, call it out, say what was really going on, and then just blame it all on the Conservatives, which genius move in my opinion. But thankfully in the US that wouldn't really work out because the right wing has staked out an anti-immigration position. But in general, we are seeing these big shakeups. Unfortunately, not all, I think the Georgescu victory would have been really shaking things up, a victory for Orthodoxy. These other victories, unfortunately, Polyev in Canada, he's a total shill. He loves Israel. The AfD in Germany, I'm confident for, but in France and these other places, again, this is all just shaking things up to try to get ahead of what might be a broader civilizational awakening to try to, in Canada, for example, the Conservatives get in, they may not have as much of a mandate to restrict immigration because, people will be complacent. They'll be like, oh, we defeated Trudeau. Finally, we got the Conservatives in. And they might restrict immigration a little bit. But frankly, Trudeau seemed like he was already going to do that. So I think it's just a lot of this is a pressure release valve people might be facing. But unless you have anything to say about that, Dimitri, we really have to move on to Africa and talking about some of that because obviously the Somalia situation is ongoing. The Sudan situation is unfolding. I believe the son of the president of Uganda, the head of the Ugandan defense, has talked about marching into Khartoum in Sudan, which he's done in the past, different countries he's talked about marching into. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on anything going on in Africa. And we, of course, have to talk about stuff going on in the East with big updates from Myanmar. All sorts of areas of the Tatmadaw control are falling, unfortunately. The Chin rebels, who I believe are more Chinese related, are taking territory. And there's even been a statement. This is the president of the exiled National Unity Government of Myanmar, Dua Lashi La, congratulated the Arakan Army, a different branch of the resistance, their leadership following the string of victories against the SAC/junta forces in the Rakhine region. He called it a victory not only for the inhabitants of the Rakhine region, but for all Burmese citizens, and called for unity in the fight for freedom. Notice, saying Burma versus Myanmar. But obviously that civil war is ongoing. It's a little bit lower grade, but it's one of the top 5 ongoing hot zones of this conflict. And again, I stand by my assessment that the Chinese need to get serious about that and actually put the Tatmadaw back in full control of all of their territory with some kind of deal with these minorities because it's not looking super sustainable right now.
No, it's really curious how around the world, these various conflicts, they keep conflagrating. Some of them, of course, move towards peace, like we see in Lebanon and Israel, but again, unsuccessfully so. And we see these large actors, for example, the US, Turkey especially, try to play these peacekeeping roles, not just in the Russo-Ukrainian conflict, but also in the East Africa region, Ethiopia, Somalia, which I think is very curious. So Turkey, again, on the 12th of December, has announced that there is a certain temporary peace agreement between Somalia and Ethiopia. The various conflicts and skirmishes that we've seen on the borders of Somaliland, Somalia, and Ethiopia proper will come to an end because Erdogan has said so, and Erdogan has spoken to the ministers of foreign affairs of all these respective countries. Now, Somaliland being a sort of independent breakaway Donetsk, Lugansk type of state away from Somalia will be hosting elections actually in this December and January, essentially a referendum on their separation from Somalia. These elections were again supported by Turkey because they want things to be recognized in a constitutional democratic type fashion. Very curious when the same sort of referendums were rejected in Crimea and Donetsk, Lugansk and other places of Eastern Europe by the international community. But in Somalia, suddenly referendums can actually mean something, right? So very curious sort of event here. But Turkey also says that Somalia and Ethiopia need to resume official talks amongst themselves in order to guarantee Ethiopia have sea access. Essentially, the agreement here is that Ethiopia will lease 20 kilometers of coastline from Somaliland, but through Somalia, in exchange for a certain peaceful agreement between these two countries. So it does seem like Erdogan is coming out as a major player, like in the entire Middle Eastern sphere of influence, right? Not just in Syria, as we see Turkey has played a major role in the recent collapse of the Syrian Arab sort of sovereign army and the Assad regime, but also in Ethiopia, Turkey is playing like a major role. The other curious thing is, again, one of the countries which is deeply anti-Turkish. This is France, again, another NATO member state, which is quite interesting when we think about NATO countries opposing one another in terms of the US supporting the Kurds, France, again, supporting Egypt and supporting Greece against Turkey as well as Egypt. As Greece builds up its air force of F-35, like high-tech stealth planes, France has openly stated that it will support Ethiopia's debt restructuring as well. Ethiopia, an incredibly poor country, unfortunately, many of its citizens are living in extreme debt. Emmanuel Macron personally has stated that Ethiopia does not owe the amount that it owes towards this closing month of December of 2024. It can actually pay less. Essentially, in summary, France will lead a review of a debt of $3.4 billion, which Macron says that Ethiopia will not essentially need to repay to France, but over a longer period of time. Again, this is assisting Ethiopia, but we do know that France is doing this in anticipation of a further Ethiopia-Somalian war, which will take place. And we do know that Turkey and Somalia are deeply aligned. So France is supporting, again, the anti-Turkish state of Ethiopia. The other curious thing is, again, the Turkish-Israeli opposition in this, because Ethiopia is seeking some sort of recognition or support from Israel as well. It's all deeply unfortunate, Conrad, because, we have a certain bias to be in favor of the Ethiopians as fellow sort of Christians in this large theater of mostly Islamic countries. And in Sudan, especially, they're surrounded by deeply unstable Islamic states, some of which are extremely violent and fundamentalist in their nature, but at the same time, we see Ethiopia itself seeking recognition and alliance with countries which are, well, shall we say, post or anti-Christian in their very nature, but perhaps not Muslim, such as Israel and, of course, Republican Masonic France. But that's just, I think, the nature of the region in and of itself. Sort of moving forward, we do see the Horn of Africa region, right, kind of attaining a temporary peace, at least towards the end of 2024, which is surprising given what's taking place in Syria. You'd think it would kind of engulf that particular region as well. But at the moment, Ethiopia and Somalia have found a sort of common tongue, and Erdogan from Turkey has come out as the sort of mediator between them in a similar fashion as to he proposed to be a mediator between Russia and Ukraine in the past. So a very major player in sort of world politics.
Now, the diplomacy going on in the Horn of Africa is obviously fascinating, but I found it so funny that Jubaland immediately erupted to almost the level of secessionist fervor as Somaliland the moment this deal was reached. So, as I said in the previous episode, I think it's time to just give up on the Somalian dream, man. Like, it's just not going to happen. It's just a failed state, and I don't think the Somalian people are high IQ enough for a nation state like that, maybe. Sorry, Somali bros, but that seems what it looks like to me. But you mentioned Syria. We've got to start wrapping things up here, so it's time to move on to our final segment here, talking about church news. And of course, the biggest developments in church persecution, not from Ukraine this week, are of course from Syria, which shouldn't surprise anybody, as there are huge Christian populations in Syria that are now under the yoke of a Israeli-backed, Turkish-backed Islamist regime. So this is from the Syrian Christians Telegram channel. Greek Orthodox Church cancels Christmas and other Christian holidays in Syria until security prevails. Statement issued by the Sanaya Church Parish Assembly, Church of the Prophet Elias the Zealot, per directives of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Antioch John X, due to current security conditions and to prevent security problems arising from individual mistakes that occur in various parts of Syria, all celebrations of Christmas, New Year, and various Christian holidays have been stopped until security and safety prevail. Christian holidays will be limited to prayers and lighting of candles. Statement also emphasizes the only guarantor of the country's progress and stability being the constitution based on citizenship and participation in its formulation by all Syrian forces and national movements in order to teach a free, democratic, civil Syria. So it's very unfortunate that that's what's going on, that there's not going to be. Remember, under Assad, there were beautiful Christmas celebrations in Damascus, Christmas trees, nativity sets, all these sorts of things. And now, unfortunately, we don't get that in a beautiful ancient Christian land. So please, please, please pray for my beloved Patriarchate of Antioch, the Christians in Syria, the churches there, the monastics, the priests, the lay people, everybody, because they certainly needed. And some other unfortunate news, you might have more details on this, Dimitri, is a fire broke out at Holy Trinity St. Sergius Lavra. It was in the bell tower, I believe. And we know that there was also an unfortunate concert that occurred, and and there was even a cooking show, I believe I saw in one of the canonical churches, and some horrible things were said. You might have more details on these events.
Yeah, fortunately, the fire that broke out in the bell tower of the Trinity Sergius Lavra was seemingly a human accident, sort of, by the monks that were staying there. At the same time, however, there are news reports that all around Russia, actually, there are arsons and sabotages being caused by the Ukrainian Special Forces, essentially the SBU, which is essentially the Ukrainian version of the CIA, but more terroristic in nature, if you can even imagine, like the Ukrainian Mossad. And this has been reported by the Russian FSB openly. So perhaps there is some truth to the fact that the Trinity Sergius Lavra is also one of the targets of the Ukrainian Special Forces. That wouldn't surprise me, because it is one of the foundational bases of, I suppose, conservative orthodoxy in the entire world. Now, the particular concert and the cooking show that took place in the refectory church of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, if for those of you not familiar, this is the church that in March 2023 were reported on. This refectory, the crosses on top of this church located in the monastery of Kiev actually turned black when the monks of the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra were kicked out of the church, and the church itself was closed. And this was one of these sort of omen-type miracles, which again spoke to the fact that the persecution of the church really began in earnest during the Great Lent of last year. But in this refectory church, it was actually conducted by a man with seemingly some sort of Tatar, perhaps a Muslim background. His name was Akim Galimov. He looks, judging by physiognomy, he looks somewhat homosexual, very sort of young director type of artsy guy. He said that this cooking show essentially was a further development of Ukrainian culture. And he said that the cooking show, which took place in the church, mind you, the ovens, the microwaves and other things were actually placed around the altar area. So it was a complete desecration of everything that was holy. It's completely unimaginable. What made this even worse was that, of course, the audience made up of various non-Orthodox people, essentially people coming to watch the cooking show, essentially the Ukrainian version of Iron Chef, if you can imagine something this blasphemous and sacrilegious, simply sat in the audience, and there was no opposition to this event taking place. But sort of highlighting the sacrilege here was that at the commencement of the cooking show itself, while it was being filmed live, they actually baked a certain loaf of bread in dedication to the pagan Slavic god Karachun. Now, they baked a loaf and they said, look, we're sort of eating this in honor of this ancient Slavic deity, this demon. Right. And it's very bizarre because Karachun, I've not read this name before in any sort of Russian historical chronicles. He's not part of the ancient Slavic pantheon. So what kind of deity or demon these Ukrainian liberals were venerating and worshiping in this occupied Orthodox church, this desecrated church, is again very questionable. But as you can see, this sort of highlights the demonic nature of the regime that has taken over Ukraine and Kiev in particular. It's something that we read about in the lives of saints, during the desecration of the Orthodox churches, by all kinds of enemies of Orthodoxy around the world. It's quite evil. And I think the positive side of recent events is that Vladimir Putin, during his 4-hour presentation, has openly spoken out in favor of the Metropolitan Onufriy and his Orthodox canonical church. And he said that he completely stands with the Orthodox Christians who are being persecuted in Ukraine. And that's very good that he's aware of what's taking place. At the same time, we have Metropolitan Paul from the Kiev-Pechersk Lavra. If you recall, Metropolitan Pavel, he's currently facing up to 8 years in prison. There's a new stage of legal proceedings, and the prosecutors of Ukraine are seeking to put him away for up to 8 years at this point. So prayers for Metropolitan Pavel, who is now will be facing a new set of hearings and trials taking place in Kiev, which is quite telling. Another, unfortunately, archpriest, this was quite based, Archpriest Vladimir Koretsky, a very right-wing Orthodox conservative priest, his house has been searched in the Odessa diocese. And this is what the Ukrainian special forces and the police officers extracted from his home. Now, this is quite comical, actually. They extracted a glass which had the sign USSR on it, SSSR. They extracted an icon of Tsar Nicholas II, a portrait of Tsar Nicholas II, and a flag with a 2-headed eagle, a Russian imperial flag, from the priest's apartment. And they said, well, this indicates your support for anti-Ukrainian forces. I mean, yeah, this is what we're dealing with here. So Archpriest Vladimir, prayers for him. Most likely there'll be he'll be invited to court, but we do see these concerts, again, taking place in various churches. And if you recall, that major Archangel Michael Cathedral in Cherkasy, which was captured in that violent riot of Metropolitan Theodosius, where he participated and he tried to fight it off, the Ukrainians have announced, the Ministry of Culture of Ukraine has officially announced that will be a Christmas concert with not one, but 2 grand pianos, a flute, various other orchestral instruments brought into the Archangel Michael Cathedral in Cherkasy on the 25th of December, on Wednesday, at 11 a.m. on Christmas. Now, we know that this is the Nativity Fast for Ukrainians. Christmas, as for all Orthodox Christians, is on the 7th of January. So during the Nativity Fast in an occupied Orthodox Christian cathedral, there will be a desecrating, sacrilegious witch Sabbath, or whatever you want to call it. Again, quite demonic. And the Ministry of Culture, this is officially the Ukrainian government, is in support of this particular act. So the persecution, as we can see, continues in earnest. We report on it every single week. And going forward, I think with the closing of 2024, and this is our 100th episode, I think one of the hallmarks of the show, Conrad, is that we, in an unfiltered fashion, report on various persecutions against the church, because we understand how this impacts, I think, geopolitics on a worldwide scale. And impact it surely does, as we know from literally reading the Holy Scriptures.
No, that couldn't be more correct. And we know that fake OCU priest on that cooking show, he called canonical Orthodox churches toilets. So, these are ridiculous people. And these are people that are going to lead their country to perdition. And that's what we're seeing as Ukraine continues to collapse, and they are on the brink of losing a lot of their energy and some of the things that are really going to start to make society start to feel the pain that the people and Christians dying on the front line are starting to feel. So we have to keep it all in prayer. But we're going to finish things off on some good news in the church, an update along the new crew to run the ship line of thinking, the prophecy from St. Porphyrios. And that is that there is a new vicar bishop for the Bulgarian diocese in the United States. And I can confirm that we have a World War Now subscriber has now become a bishop. And I'm going to read this from orthochristian.com. His Holiness Patriarch Daniel and a host of hierarchs of the Bulgarian Orthodox Church consecrated a new vicar bishop for the Diocese of the USA, Canada, and Australia on Sunday, December 15th. At its session on December 10th, the Bulgarian Holy Synod approved the request for a vicar for the elderly Metropolitan Joseph, 82, the ruling hierarch of the Diaspora Diocese. And yesterday, Archimandrite Clement, a monk of the Athonite Zografu Monastery, was consecrated at the Patriarchal Cathedral of St. Alexander Nevsky, reports the Bulgarian Orthodox Church. Previously, the current patriarch, who we know as the saintly Patriarch Daniel, served as the vicar to Metropolitan Joseph from 2010 to 2018. So the position that Bishop Clement is filling was previously held by the Metropolitan. The Bulgarian primate was previously held by the Patriarch. The Bulgarian primate was joined by 12 hierarchs, including Metropolitan Joseph, clergy from throughout Bulgaria, and spiritual brothers of the new bishop from Zografu. The cathedral was also filled with Orthodox faithful. Before the start of the Divine Liturgy, Archimandrite Clement pronounced his episcopal promises and confessed the Orthodox faith by reading the Nicene Creed. The cathedral resounded with cries of Axios during the episcopal consecration during the liturgy. At the end of the Divine Liturgy, Patriarch Daniel presented the new bishop with a staff and delivered a speech. We know you as a sincere and deeply believing man and Christian, as a zealous monk, diligent in the monastic obediences that you once chose to bear in the Zografu Holy Monastery in the garden of the Holy Mother of God. Mount Athos, dear to every Orthodox Bulgarian heart. We also know and respect the life path you have walked in the world, which spontaneously and quite naturally evokes in our minds the apostolic words and call, but covet earnestly the best gifts, and yet shew I unto you a more excellent way. And then Bishop Clement went on to make some comments. He said, the episcopate is a sacred ministry that transcends the limitations of modest spiritual and physical human capabilities. It is a gift of God and an opportunity for the unfolding of sacramental evangelism for the salvation of people in God's holy church. Most Holy Master, behold, God has provided that I receive through your holy archpastoral hands all 3 graceful hierarchical degrees of priesthood. You ordained me to the diaconal and priestly ranks, and today also the episcopal rank. You, Most Holy Master, most fully understand my excitement with which I approach my future church ministry, since you in your capacity as Bishop of Dragovita for almost 7 years and until your election as Metropolitan of Vidin, were a Vicar Bishop of the Metropolitan Joseph of OCA, of USA, Canada, and Australia. I thank you with all my heart. And I had the joyous opportunity to meet the then Father Clement when he was at Zografu Monastery on Mount Athos. He spoke with us for several hours, and I can confirm his English is excellent, and he is a pious and holy monastic who will take his episcopal role very seriously and does not balk at any parts of the monastic and Athonite tradition. You can read into that what you will, but he is a very
Mhm.
strict but at the same time, loving man. He is smiling and very warm and a kind person. So he was very hospitable to us. He provided us wonderful hospitality, and then, went on to serve hours and hours long liturgies, and then continued to help work at the monastery. He is a very impressive man. And before he became a monastic in 2009 at Zografu, he was an economics professor at elite universities in Europe, and he was appointed as an economist to the Directorate General of the Economic and Financial Affairs Division of the European Commission in Brussels. And 2 years after that, he then became a monastic. So it shows you what EU bureaucracy will make you realize about the world and make you realize what's really important, because he then went to pursue the angelic path, not the economic path. But we are very grateful for it. And we're grateful that America will be getting another Holy Athonite bishop on top of Bishop Alexei we have in Alaska. So it's very wonderful to hear. And I think, again, as I said, this is the fulfillment of St. Porphyrios' prophecy about the new crew to come and run the ship. And I think that's a great story to end things on. But again, I have to thank everybody for listening. 100 episodes. It really means a lot that you've tuned in. Please share this. Obviously, it helps the show grow. And again, I have so many people to thank. If I didn't thank you earlier on in the show, please, I didn't forget you. I know it's recording right now. It's hard to remember everybody. But if you helped in any way with the show, if you shared, if you've been involved in this, you know who you are. Thank you so much, priests, everybody that has advised us, monastics, my parents, other people, even that have, been here for me through all of the show, and, hit piece articles written against me, all these sorts of things. So you know who you are if you contributed to this. I want to thank you very much from the bottom of my heart. And I want to get any last words you have on this week's analysis, Dimitri.
Absolutely. It's been a packed week. I'm happy to be back. And of course, for everybody interested in the fall of Syria, I'd recommend go back and listen to episode 99, one of the most detailed episodes I think that we've released out of these 100, and impressive catalog. And I just want to thank you personally, Conrad, for creating World War Now, this particular media company, for putting in all this time, effort. I think everybody really appreciates it. And thank you for hosting this wonderful show. I'm really honored to be a co-host on it, and honored to sort of participate and to give all my input. I'm honored to write articles and to contribute. So, and I appreciate all the great listeners, the subscribers, those who've helped financially or who've advised us, who've given feedback. So thank you, everyone. 100 episodes. It's a huge milestone, and hopefully to many more going forward.
I couldn't agree more. And thank you, Dimitri, for agreeing to be my co-host coming on the show. I remember back in August, September of 2022, when I first started talking to you about this, and you were like, sure, let's do it. And I highly doubt either of us thought we'd be here 2 years later, 100 plus episodes talking about the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria. So crazy things have happened, of course. And like I said, the audience, you guys are the ones that make it all possible. So thank you all so much. And with all of that, you know what to do. worldwarnow.co. If you haven't already subscribed, please do get behind that paywall here. Our latest Ether Hour episode, it's me talking to Timothy Honeycutt about the firmament. It's a fantastic episode. I've gotten some wonderful feedback on it. So that's going to be linked below. Check that out. We talk about the patristic perspective on cosmology, some globe earth, flat earth stuff, the firmament, what it really is, and the importance of understanding where we live in a Christian context. Dimitri's article, of course, Ritual Regicide Part 2, also recently came out, so be sure to check that out. We're going to have an upcoming Ether Hour episode discussing that whole article. So if you haven't read the whole 50,000 words, look forward to that. And again, the Discord server is up now. That is available, but worldwarnow.co. Get on the paywall, get on the Substack, get your email there. That's the best place to find us. World War Now on YouTube. That's our YouTube channel. Please subscribe. If you're only subscribed on Substack, get over and subscribe on YouTube as well. We do live streams there and post clips and other things. So really check it out. Subscribe, of course, on Twitter, X, World War Now _ Follow us there. We are growing very fast. Follow me on X at GnomeRad. Follow Dimitri at OCanonist. We have a Rumble channel as well. You can follow us there, but also Telegram. We passed 4,000 followers on Telegram. So thank you very much. World War Now Telly, 24/7 news feed. A lot of great things on there. And like I said, the World War Now Discord server is now up as well. All of these things are going to be linked down below. If you want to help us out, make clips, make edits, if you've got any technical skills, please join the Discord server and help us out. We will talk to you directly there. It's a great community. Dimitri and I are posting in there multiple times a day, talking to the subscribers. So please check that out. But again, home base, worldwarnow.co. That's where everything happens. Please subscribe. And with all of that, thank you so much for listening to the end of this 100th episode. It really is an honor to make this show for you. And I appreciate all of you very, very, very much. And with all of that, we will see you on the next one. God bless.